Okay, this is the second video in our series of videos on business model patterns or revenue models. How, again, we're focused on how do we actually capture value and make money for our new venture. So we're going to talk about a couple different patterns. Just to work here. So the simplest one is just a single purchase. If I buy leaf springs for my pickup truck, yeah, it's not more complicated than I send them money and they send me leaf springs. So if you're just going to sell goods or services and you anticipate just using a single purchase, then you want to think a little bit about pricing. There's some different ways to think about pricing. One thing might be just think about what it costs you to deliver that good or service, and then make sure that you've got a premium over that. So if we go back to the watermelon joke, obviously that person buying a watermelon for $1 and selling it for $1 hadn't really thought through the costs. Now it seems simple in a watermelon joke, but if you actually break down the good or the service that you're selling, the cost can actually get fairly complex. I was helping a doctor's office one time think about the costs of particular services, and it was pretty complicated to get in there and think about the different procedures and the amount of time and what it costs to deliver those procedures and the likelihood that the particular client was going to pay and what was their payment arrangement, and you can start to learn some pretty important things as you break down the costs of different goods or services. So if you're selling, if you're painting people's houses, right, and you're charging for painting, you want to think about things like time, like materials, like depreciation of assets. So how long can you use that spray paint, the gun to spray the house? All those things need to be factored in, and if not, you might be undercharging for your particular good or service. A second thing to think about is the value created. So I've got a Picasso painting here. Probably when Picasso paintings are sold today, they don't just think about the cost of producing them, right? So they're not just looking at Picasso's time and saying, oh, we think it took him, 12 hours to paint this painting, and the paints cost, this is $32 worth of oil paint, and so forth, right? That's not how Picasso paintings are sold. Instead, they're sold based on the value that gets created. Now, it's sort of an abstract value. Maybe not everybody sees it, but for a certain set of consumers, Picasso paintings have a ton of value. And that's how they're priced. Another thing you want to think about is the competition. So corn farmers, and there's lots of them here in Ohio, they do need to think about the costs of the inputs, and they pay a lot of attention to that. But they don't get to dictate the price of corn. Instead, the price of corn is really set by the market. It's what's the willingness to pay. How many corn farmers are there this year? Was it a good year or bad year in terms of the weather? What's the demand like coming from China? All these things, the competition in the broader market, supply and demand, are ultimately what shapes the price of corn. So when you're pricing things, you need to understand the costs that go into a single transaction. You need to think about the value that you're potentially creating for customers. You need to think about what the competition is doing. And maybe you don't have direct competition. It's not like corn. But perhaps think about how are people solving this problem right now? What does it cost them to solve the problem right now with the current methods? So all those things are factors that will play into deciding what to charge for a given good or service. Now we can think about a similar scenario, but maybe extrapolate a little bit. And we say, well, what if we have multiple purchases? It's not just a one-time deal, but maybe I want more of an ongoing relationship with my customer. There's different ways to think about this. So the razor blade model is a famous example. And what this means is razor companies figured out, if we can sell a high-end razor to somebody, and maybe we sell it at cost or even at a slight loss, because once they've got the high-end razor, what we're really going to sell them are the razor blades, and we can replace those, and those are pretty cheap. But once they're locked into our model, that's really where we'll make our money. So if you think about printers, this is another great example of this. So if you buy an HP printer, we've done that before, bought a cheap HP printer, and it's surprising how little it costs these days to buy a low-end printer, right? And you think, man, are they even making money on this? And the answer is Probably not. The printer itself is just dirt cheap. But what costs a ton of money is the ink. And so they've set up a revenue model where they want to encourage people to buy their printers. So they sell them really, really cheap. And then they make a lot of money selling the ink, which happens to be quite cheap. And they charge, whatever it is, $30 or $20, $25 or something for an ink cartridge that probably couldn't have cost them, I don't know, but $1 or $2 at the most. And so that's an example of this sort of razor blade strategy, an extreme example. Loyalty programs. How can you encourage people to come back? 9 ice cream cones and the 10th one is free or whatever it is. This is a sweet rewards program from Graders. You might even think about getting your customers to prepay. So Lime scooters, you charge up a certain amount of credit. Once you've got that credit on your phone, you're likely to use the Lime scooter again, even if there are other alternatives, just because you've already prepaid for it. That also has advantages for Lime scooter in the sense that they get money before they even have to deliver the good or service. That makes their life easier, in terms of working capital or how much money they have on hand to undertake their operations. So again, single purchase, think about these things in terms of pricing multiple purchases. Maybe we think about ways to engage with our customers over the long term. So if we think about these questions, again, who is the customer, who is the consumer? This is going to be really relevant for how you're setting up these kinds of pricing structures. What is our cost structure, fixed versus variable? You need to make sure that you're actually covering your costs, and you can't do that if you don't understand your pricing structure. What happens to our cost during a single transaction? Maybe you realize that, we lose money on the first transaction or we break even, but then these subsequent transactions is where we make all of our money. What's that relationship with the customer, with the consumer? Is this a one-time deal, or are you buying a Seattle Seahawks helmet for your kid once? Or is this something that might lead to a long-term ongoing relationship? And then finally, how are you going to acquire customers? What do you need to do in terms of your pricing to make sure that customers come on board? So let's think about a second model here. And this is a pretty common one these days. This is the freemium model. And what this refers to is that you've got a portion of your product or service that you provide for free. And then there's a premium version. And that's where you make your money. And so at least one customer segment is able to benefit free of charge. Non-paying parts of the business model are financed by another customer segment, the premium customers. So Dropbox is an example of this, LinkedIn, and there's lots and lots of examples. Let's talk about a specific one. We'll talk about Skype. I would imagine, and when I've done this session live, if I ask for a show of hands, how many of you pay for Skype? The answer is almost nobody. Right? So Skype offers a lot of services for free. You can call computer to computer. You can host meetings. You can have multiple people on the call at the same time. All these are free services, and you don't have to pay for Skype. Who does pay for Skype? Well, I do. I'm subsidizing all of you free riders. So I use Skype all the time. I use Skype Credit, which I purchase to call from my computer to phones generally in other countries is why I'm using Skype. So if I make a phone call on my on a landline, which I still have in my office, if I call down to Nicaragua on my landline, it costs me like $5 a minute. I don't do that because I don't want to pay $5 a minute. If I call on Skype, it only costs me about, I forget if it's 24 cents a minute or 27 cents a minute. But it's much cheaper, and so I essentially have a premium Skype. I use a premium Skype, a version of Skype, where I purchase Skype credit and I pay for calls from my computer to landlines in places like Nicaragua, or Guatemala, or India. So most people will use the free version, but there's always a subset that finds value in the premium version. And lots of freemium models will have like an ad-free version or enhanced features, all kinds of things to convince people to get that premium version. So who is the customer? Who's the consumer? Again, in this case, there's probably a free customer that's probably a little bit different than the paid customer. What's our cost structure? This is really important for this particular model. You don't see all-you-can-eat buffets with a freemium version. So you can imagine a scenario where you go into an all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet and they say, tell you what, we've got a freemium model. You can eat all the rice you want for free, and then if you want meat or vegetables, it's going to cost you. And the reason is, at least in part, there's probably a number of reasons, but at least in part, this idea of fixed versus variable costs. So Skype, because it's a technological product, essentially giving the services away for free costs them very, very little, almost nothing, right, for an additional consumer. If I'm in a buffet, that rice isn't free for me. Maybe it's not that expensive, but it costs me some money. So if your product actually costs you money, if you have variable costs, then the freemium model may not work very well for you, unless you can really, really ensure that the premium version you can make lots of money. What happens to our cost during a single transaction? Again, you need to understand if you're giving your service away for free, is that going to cost you anything, or is the cost pretty negligible? What's your relationship with the customer consumer? Probably these models work best where there's a long-term relationship. And how will we acquire customers? This is where the freemium model really shines. Oftentimes people are pretty hesitant to sign up for a new service, and part of that hesitancy may be that you don't know how good the service is without actually trying it out, without using it. The freemium model allows you to give people a look into the product or service and test it out and decide if it's worth it to them to actually take money out of their pocket. So the app I'm using right now to record this lecture is Screencast-O-Matic, and I used the free version a couple of times and decided, yeah, this is worth taking money out of my pocket. And I went ahead and bought the premium version so I could record these videos for the class. Probably would not have purchased this app without the ability to test it a little bit. And so it was very important in this case that it had a freemium version available. The last thing I want to say about freemium models is it can be very easy to overestimate how many premium users you'll have. Often the number is incredibly small. So for example, with Dropbox, they estimate, this estimate's a couple years old, but to give you a sense, that, that 97.5% of all their users were free users, and only 2.5% of their users were premium users. And so if you have a freemium model, you need to be able to pay for your product or service, pay for your venture, understanding that a very tiny percentage of all your customers are probably going to actually be paying customers. So we're going to go next to unbundling, but I'm going to go ahead and stop this video here just so the videos don't get too long and unwieldy and cumbersome. So if you need to take a break or anything else, we'll come back with part 3 of our revenues and our revenue model video series whenever you're ready.